Buddhist point of view, we are encouraged to take a long view and encouraged not to take short view. What does long view or short view mean? Long view means thinking about long term in the future, long term, what's going to happen in the long term. And not so much about what's going to happen in the short term. When we think about the short term, there's a difficulty here, because when we don't experience long term, we experience short term. We experience here and now, right? We're experiencing what's happening in front of you here and now. And when we're experiencing what's happening here and now, it's very vivid. It's very alive and very vivid and colourful. But when we think about long term, then it's much more hazy. It's much more hidden. And so generally, in our worldly dealings, we deal short term. What's happening here is so vivid and so alive and so here and now that we react just to that situation. And we forget the long term, because the long term seems so hidden, so far away. But the Buddha indicated that this is one of our biggest problems, is if we act in that way, then we create big problems and difficulties. For instance, say you're having an argument with somebody. So then that person gets angry with you, maybe swears at you. Then what happens? Immediately we have anger arises in us, or irritation, or some sort of strong emotion arises in us, and we want to go against that other person. We want to answer them, or we want to harm them in some way. That's what I mean by something being very vivid. It's there in the moment, and it's very live, and it's very colourful to our mind at that time. So if we take the short term, if we take the short view, then immediately we allow that emotion that comes up to dictate our action. Then we shout at the other person, or we harm them in some way, we argue with them, and then we try to get the better of them. We try to overcome them in some way. But the Buddha said, if you look at the result of that, if you look on the ongoing result of that, you find actually that's very harmful. It's not very beneficial. Maybe we do overcome that person in the short term, but in the long term, if you look at the long term, and you see that's actually not very helpful at all. It's not beneficial. And why is it not beneficial? Well, firstly, in the short term, it harms the other person. It harms the other person. If you overcome the other person, they feel miserable. They feel resentful towards you, and then in the future they see you as enemy, and they harm you. So from their point of view, it doesn't bring a solution. It doesn't bring a solution. It brings difficulty. And then if you look at it from one's own side, if one has argued with somebody, even overcome them, then of course there's some satisfaction in the mind. But that satisfaction, what is the satisfaction telling our psychology? That satisfaction is saying, okay, this is okay sort of thing to do. I can do this and overcome others by getting angry and by harming them. So it's okay to do this. And then we do it again in the future. And we do it again in the future. And we do it again in the future. And in the end, we make enemies of everybody. You know, everybody becomes our enemy, because we continually are trying to overcome them. We're getting angry with them and overcoming them, and then they feel resentful, and then all sorts of negative things happen in the future. And that habit of short-term, satisfying the short term, that habit gets bigger and bigger. It grows in our mind, because the mind is like blotting paper. It sucks everything up, and then that stain stays in the mind, and then a habit develops, and then it goes worse and worse. So in the long term, reacting in the short term, in the long term causes problems and difficulties. Now the Buddha said, if you can overcome the vividness of the short term, that's the colour and the excitement of the short term, and instead keep your mind focused on the long term, then it's actually going to the result is going to be much bigger, much better. So if we take again, for instance, the argument. So we have an argument with somebody, and but instead now of allowing that anger or irritation or what emotion that comes up, instead of allowing that emotion to dictate our actions, we calm ourselves and we keep ourselves calm. We don't retaliate. We don't go against the other person. We try to be kind and to be gentle and not to react to the vividness of the moment. Then, even though it's difficult to do that. It's difficult not to act out of the emotion when it comes. If we manage to do that, then look at the result. Even if the other person might feel, they've overcome, they've beaten you, but actually they leave with a more calm mind, a more happy mind. And if you look at your own mind, you see that even though you might feel a little bit uncomfortable, at least you feel satisfied that you haven't caused any problems and difficulties. And when you look back on the situation, when you look back later on in the argument, you see that the argument was not worth getting all upset about. Usually our arguments are not worth getting upset about. In the time, they appear to be very, really, I must get upset about this. But when you look back on them, you think, what was all that about? That was such a big fuss about nothing. And so when you look back and you see, in the short term I managed to keep my mind peaceful and calm, then I didn't create any problems over such a small thing. So this means, and then again we don't create the habit of getting angry. We create the habit of staying peaceful and calm in every situation. We're creating that habit whatever happens, I tend to stay peaceful and calm. And in the long term, we can see that that's much better, a much better habit to have than to allow the short-term emotion and short-term burdens to take over us, to take us over and to make us act in a impulsive sort of way. So the Buddha encouraged us always to think long-term. And when we think long-term, that means one word, that means karma. So karma means long-term. What is the long-term consequences of our actions? So if we can always keep in mind karma, my karma, what am I creating in the long term? What am I creating in the long term? Then it's easier for us to overcome the negative aspects of the mind. The mind that wants to make us retaliate when we get angry, or when we get attached, to really sort of cling and desire. If we think about the long term, which means karma, then it's much easier for us to keep the mind peaceful and calm. So there's, for example, there was one monk teacher, and he was very famous. He had many students, and he was known as a very moral person, and he gave very good Dhamma lectures and so on. So he had lots of students. And then there was one time, one of his disciples was a woman, and her mind was a bit disturbed, and she developed a sexual attraction towards him. She wanted him to marry her, to take her as his wife. And he said, no, I'm a monk, I can't do this. This is not. And she persisted, but he kept on saying, no, I can't do this. So she got a bit angry. And then she went to another man, and she had a child from another man. And she was still resentful towards this monk for not taking her as his wife. So then she took this child when it was a baby, and when the monk was teaching to a whole lot of people, she put this child in his lap and said, "Here, this is your child. and she walked off. So now you can imagine what all the people in front of the monk must have thought. Some of them thought, oh, this monk is, he's not such a good monk after all. He's going with these women and so on. And so a lot of his disciples lost confidence in him, lost faith, and they got up and walked out. But some of the disciples said, there's something fishy going on here, so they kept their faith in him, and they just said, okay, let's see what happens here. And so the monk just carried on teaching. He took the child, he said, okay, and he calmed the child down, and he held the child, and then he continued teaching, and then he took the child home and he looked after it. He kept his mind very peaceful and calm, didn't get upset by the situation at all. So then after a few days or a couple of weeks or so, then the woman realized, oh, I've made a mistake, this was a big mistake. So she decided to go back to the monk, and she said, oh, I'm very sorry that I did that. That was a big mistake. Now please can I have my child back? And then the monk said, oh, here, take your child. And she took the child back and went off. And the monk just carried on. He didn't change his ways at all. He just carried on doing what he normally did. He carried on teaching, carried on doing whatever he did. Now, this is an example of if we think long term, and even if we get into a situation like that, very bad for a monk to be revealed to the monk as a child by a woman, then of course you could get upset, get angry, say, oh, this isn't, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing? I'm a monk, how come? Blah, blah. He could have caused a big fuss. But he didn't. He kept his mind peaceful and calm. And in that way, he created no negative karma. From his side, no negative karma. He did everything that was beneficial for the situation. He looked after the child, and he kept the woman at a distance, but he didn't get angry with her, didn't scold her or anything. And so, from his point of view, the mind stays very peaceful and calm, and no negative karma was created. Of course, from her point of view, that's a different story, but anyway. It's just an example of how if we train our mind to take a long view, always to take a long view, and to see the situation that we're in as only short term. The situation of the child was only short term. If you take time, then the situation of the monk and the child is only short term. And usually our situations are only short term. The problems that we encounter are not, they don't go on for long term, they're short term. If we can see that they're short term, but we need to take a long term view of them so that we don't create problems and difficulties for ourselves and others, then it's much easier to keep our mind peaceful and calm. So, always remembering karma means take a long-term view. Take a long-term view. Don't take the short-term view. Even though it's much easier and it's easier and also it's more vivid to take the short-term view. Through our mental impulses, we'd rather take the short-term view. If you follow our impulses, we're always taking short-term view. But if we remember that short-term view usually leads to problems and difficulties, and long-term view will lead to much better results when we train our mind to take long-term view of everything and let things go. Let things go, because things are situations usually don't last for all that long. They pass on by, and then we're dealing with something else. So thank you again for inviting us here today and listening so attentively. May your lives be very happy and peaceful. May you always take the long-term view, and may it result in you very, very quickly attaining Nirvana. Thank you.